They underestimated your silence. They mistook your calm for cluelessness, your stillness for ignorance, your lack of defense for defeat. You let them think they were outsmarting you. You let them build confidence on the illusion of superiority. But all along you were aware, watching patterns, memorizing motives, decoding the unsaid. You knew their tone before they spoke, their excuses before they formed, their betrayals before they happened. You allowed them to expose themselves piece by piece, pretending not to notice as they revealed their true nature. That restraint was your intelligence in motion. You didn't need to announce that you knew. You let the clock speak for you. Time always exposes the fool who confuses subtlety for stupidity. And now they sit in silence, humiliated by the realization that you were never naive. You were simply strategic enough to let them believe their own performance until it collapsed under its own arrogance. The sting of being seen without knowing it cuts deeper than any insult. They mocked your patience because they couldn't comprehend it. To them, wisdom always looks passive until it moves. They wanted you reactive, emotional, predictable. But you played invisible. You studied from the shadows while they performed in the light. You saw through their charm, their contradictions, their masks of morality. You noticed every shift in tone, every flicker of guilt behind their words. You learned early that people confess most through what they avoid. And now, as truth stands bare, they realize how much you absorbed while pretending to listen. Their confidence rotted under your quiet observation. They thought you were behind them, but you were 10 steps ahead, tracking their every illusion with surgical precision. That's what makes them feel foolish now. Not that they lied, but that you let them. They weren't deceiving you. They were auditioning for their own exposure. You never needed to confront them. They destroyed themselves through consistency. You didn't interrupt their stories. You watched how they recycled them. You didn't need to shout. You let repetition betray them. People reveal truth through patterns more than words. And you, patient as gravity, allowed their habits to speak louder than their mouths. You gave them enough rope to tie their reputation in knots. The day they realized you knew the entire time was the day they lost the illusion of superiority. Manipulators survive on perception. The moment you stop reacting, they lose oxygen. You mastered the art of quiet warfare. You turned understanding into armor. They now see how every joke, every smug assumption, every backhanded move only exposed them further. They thought they were playing you, but you were testing them. And when they failed, you didn't flinch. You simply closed the book and left them buried under the weight of their own pretense. They will call it coincidence, timing, intuition, anything but your intelligence. Admitting you always knew would crush their ego completely. So they hide behind excuses, rewriting the past to make it seem less embarrassing. But you can see it in their body language. The hesitation, the forced calm, the eyes that won't meet yours anymore. You've entered their thoughts like a haunting. Every conversation replays in their head now. Every moment they underestimated you. They remember your half smiles and realize they weren't clueless. They were controlled. You never argued because you didn't need to. You didn't prove them wrong. You let them do it themselves. And now they hate that their undoing wasn't your words, but their own reflection. The quiet ones terrify the pretentious because they expose truth without trying. You didn't just see through them. You let them see through themselves. That's why their shame burns. It's not that you won, it's that they lost to their own facade. They tried to measure your intelligence by your response time, forgetting that wisdom doesn't compete with noise. They thought fast talk meant depth and mockery meant wit, but your silence made their noise echo louder, revealing how hollow it really was. You played chess while they were busy drawing attention on a checkers board. They thought control came from dominating conversation, but you understood it came from knowing what not to say. You were never proving, you were predicting. And each time they underestimated you, you gathered more clarity. Now the tables have turned, and their own words stand as monuments of their short-sightedness. People who mistake quiet confidence for ignorance eventually find out that awareness always waits. You didn't rush to defend yourself because you knew something they didn't. Truth never demands validation. It reveals itself when arrogance runs out of lies. And they just ran out, What they feel now is the weight of exposure. There's no theatrical ending, no confrontation, just silence heavy with realization. They know that every move they made was under your gaze. Every deception, every manipulation, every condescending smirk. It all aged poorly in the light of your composure. You made no threats, yet your awareness became punishment enough. They can't erase the memory of being studied while believing they were in control. There's no antidote for that kind of humiliation. They will replay it for years, trying to find the moment they lost your respect. You didn't take revenge, you reclaimed dignity. You didn't strike back, you watched them implode. Because nothing dismantles arrogance like the slow realization that the person they dismissed was the one holding all the knowledge all along. You always sensed their intentions before they unfolded. You could feel when the tone shifted, when loyalty became performance, when curiosity turned into competition. You read people through their emotional residue, the contradictions between their words and their energy. That's what separated you from them. They played tactics, and you played intuition. And intuition beats tactics because it reads intent, not performance. You learned to listen between sentences, to decode pauses, to spot projection before it even formed. They never stood a chance against awareness that deep. You saw who they were trying to be and who they really were. And you didn't need to expose it. Life did that for you. Now they shrink in your presence, not because you said anything, but because you saw everything. That kind of knowing can't be undone. It lingers in their conscience like a silent verdict. The most powerful moment was when you stopped caring about their recognition. You no longer needed to prove what you knew. That's when your energy shifted completely. They felt it. The control they thought they had evaporated the second you detached from validation. You didn't need to win anymore. You had outgrown the game. You didn't need to correct their lies. Truth was already dismantling them in private. They now realized you were never the naive one. They were the fool trying to manipulate someone who saw too clearly. The power dynamic inverted quietly. You didn't conquer them. You let them collapse under their own arrogance. That's the ultimate checkmate, calm detachment, while chaos devours the pretenders. They once believed they were pulling strings. Now, they sit in silence, realizing the puppet never moved. You just let them believe you did. There's an unspoken poetry in watching pride dissolve into embarrassment. They used to look at you with mockery, but now their gaze carries caution. They know better than to underestimate you again. They whisper about how you changed, pretending the version they laughed at was naive. But you didn't change. You simply stopped pretending not to see. You no longer soften your intelligence to protect fragile egos. You learned that understanding people deeply means outgrowing them silently. And that's what you did. You let them discover their foolishness on their own. Their regret isn't about being wrong. It's about realizing how right you were while they mocked you. The irony burns quietly inside them. You don't need revenge when their memory keeps serving them reminders of every time they underestimated you. They had entire speeches prepared for you once. Long rehearsed lines filled with justification, blame, and twisted logic that made them feel powerful. They used to talk over you, around you, through you, always trying to dominate the air between you with noise. But when the truth finally surfaced, when their illusions cracked under the weight of time, they found nothing left to say. The silence didn't arrive with warning. It entered like consequence. Every lie they told lost its power once it was met with your calm. Every excuse died mid-sentence when you didn't bite. You didn't need to interrupt them. You just stood still, and they felt it, the shift in dynamic. They realized they were performing for someone who had already read the script. There's nothing to say when the mask is gone, no recovery when the stage lights burn out. Their greatest punishment wasn't exposure. It was your silence swallowing their performance whole. They kept searching for words, hoping to rebuild what had already collapsed. But truth has a way of removing vocabulary from the guilty. You didn't yell, didn't demand, didn't explain. You simply watched them stumble through the debris of their own lies. They tried to recreate the same emotional hold they once had, but it no longer worked. Every phrase they used sounded empty, every apology rehearsed. They could feel your detachment like gravity, heavy, unmovable, final. The conversation they wanted depended on your reaction, and you gave them none. That absence stripped them of power. They used to find their confidence in your confusion, but now you were unreadable. You weren't seeking closure, you were closure. And in that moment, they discovered the most terrifying truth of all. That silence is not absence. Silence is consequence. When you said nothing, it told them everything they needed to hear. You didn't plan their silence. It was a natural reaction to realization. People who live in lies lose language when faced with truth. They rely on distraction, performance, and guilt, not authenticity. Once you removed emotion from the equation, they had no material left. They looked for words, but the vocabulary of manipulation only works on those who still care. You had outgrown caring. That's what made your presence so unsettling. You weren't angry, you were done. That kind of peace makes dishonest people panic. They need chaos to maintain control, and you denied them that gift. You left them standing in the quiet they once mocked, forced to listen to the echoes of their own deceit. When truth arrives, it doesn't scream, it steals words, and the silence it leaves behind becomes a mirror they can't look away from. They found nothing left to say, because every word now exposes the very thing they tried to hide. The silence between you wasn't awkward. It was verdict. You didn't need to punish them. They punished themselves through awareness. You could see the shift in their body language. The slouched shoulders, the eyes that couldn't hold yours. The shallow breathing of someone realizing the performance is over. They tried to regain control through tone, but confidence cannot be faked in the presence of truth. You didn't interrupt. You didn't retaliate. You simply let the silence expand until it filled the room with consequence. That's when they felt the weight of what they'd done, not from what you said, but from what you withheld. Manipulators thrive on reactions because reactions validate them. When you stop reacting, their power dies. You didn't need revenge, you just stopped giving them energy. And in that vacuum, their entire character collapsed. They thought they could argue their way out of guilt, but guilt doesn't need debate, it needs silence. They wanted redemption, but not responsibility. That's why their words failed. You can't fix what you refuse to admit. They hoped charm would erase memory, that soft tones could undo betrayal, but forgiveness requires truth, and truth requires humility. Two currencies they never learned to earn. They were trying to sell sincerity to someone who had already stopped buying. So their words came out flat, mechanical, desperate. You saw through every attempt to manipulate guilt into reconciliation. And still, you said nothing. Because sometimes silence isn't forgiveness. It's acknowledgement that the lesson has ended. You no longer needed closure from them. You found it in detachment. Their sentences crumbled because your peace made their tactics irrelevant. You didn't reject them out of spite. You simply no longer needed what they were offering. And that realization struck them harder than any insult ever could. They found nothing left to say because you had already outgrown their language. The silence carried more truth than words ever could. They once used dialogue as a weapon, twisting communication into control. But the moment you stopped playing, they lost their script. There was no debate left to win, no misunderstanding left to exploit. You saw their intentions so clearly that conversation became unnecessary. They could feel it in your presence. The end had already happened. They just hadn't accepted it yet. And that's why they stuttered when they finally faced you. They weren't apologizing, they were trying to undo exposure. But exposure can't be reversed. You can't unsee what you've seen. The quiet between you wasn't emptiness. It was evidence. You no longer needed to explain who they were, and they no longer had the vocabulary to hide it. That's what silence does. It removes pretense, leaving only truth. And truth always outlasts words. Every manipulator eventually runs out of performance. Words are their currency, but truth bankrupts them. They thought they could talk their way through consequence, but you took away their only weapon, your attention. Without it, they had no audience, no applause, no feedback loop to fuel their illusion. You let their ego implode under its own weight. They mistook your restraint for weakness until they realized it was control. That's when the silence became unbearable. They started explaining things you never asked about, trying to fill the void with noise. But silence doesn't negotiate, It doesn't argue. It simply waits. And in that waiting, they faced the one thing they always avoided, themselves. That's why they found nothing left to say. Because deep down, they knew any new sentence would only prove your point. Their arrogance had finally met the end of its vocabulary. You remember the way they used to dominate conversation? How easily they could spin stories, twist facts, and redirect blame. It was impressive once. How effortlessly they manipulated attention. But now, stripped of illusion, fallible, ordinary. Their voice lost its rhythm. Their sentences lost their bite. Every lie had aged beyond repair. There was nothing left to defend, nothing left to disguise. You didn't gloat, you didn't smile. You simply let the silence breathe, because silence doesn't demand, it exposes. And they couldn't hide inside it anymore. They realized too late that the power they thought they had was borrowed from your willingness to engage. You took that back, and suddenly their empire of words collapsed into rubble. They weren't just speechless, they were powerless. Because when control ends, language becomes useless. Time has a way of turning arrogance into apology without words. They won't say it out loud, but you'll see it in their eyes, the quiet shame of someone who finally understands. They used to believe you would never leave, that your patience meant permanence. But patience was your strategy, not your weakness. You let them reveal themselves fully before walking away. And now, as they look at the wreckage of what they destroyed, they find no words that fit the moment. Apologies can't resurrect trust. Regret doesn't rewrite memory. You don't need to hear them say sorry. Their silence says it for them. Because guilt always speaks, even when the mouth can't. They found nothing left to say because truth had already said everything for you. They expected rage. They wanted it even. Because anger is predictable, it gives them a script to hide behind. If you had shouted, they could have called you emotional. If you had cried, they could have called you weak. But you didn't give them that gift. You gave them silence, and it terrified them. That kind of quiet doesn't need explanation. It holds judgment without words. You didn't need to defend yourself, didn't need to outline the betrayal or repeat the proof. You simply withdrew your presence, your energy, your acknowledgement. The noise they built their confidence on fell apart. They couldn't reason with silence because silence reflects truth. It doesn't negotiate. They tried to provoke you just to feel alive again, but you stayed still. And in that stillness, they heard it. The sound of their own guilt echoing back at them. Nothing haunts a betrayer more than the silence of someone they can no longer reach. You learned that silence is not passivity, it's precision. When someone betrays you, their goal is reaction. They feed on it. They need you to make noise so they can twist it, reframe it, repaint themselves as victims. But when you go silent, you deny them oxygen. You don't validate, you don't explain, you don't justify. You let truth sit there, untouched, heavy. They squirm under its weight because there's nothing to argue with. Silence cannot be contradicted. You took their control by refusing to participate in their narrative. That's why it's devastating, because they built their power on your engagement. The moment you stopped responding, you became unpredictable. They replayed every moment, every word, every act, searching for your reaction, but there was none. And in the absence of reaction, they realized something horrifying. Your silence wasn't confusion, it was awareness. You were no longer trying to be understood. You were watching them collapse under the weight of what they'd done. At first, they took your silence as weakness. They mistook it for surrender because manipulators always misread restraint. They expected chaos, they got composure. They tried to provoke emotion, to spark conflict, to reignite the pattern that made them feel powerful. But you didn't play. You weren't holding back words, you were holding back access. That difference broke them. They couldn't reason with your stillness because reasoning requires permission. You denied them that privilege. You didn't block them out of hate, you outgrew the need to be heard by liars. That's what silence is at its peak, not avoidance, but evolution. You stopped defending your side of the story because you realized anyone worth your energy already knew it. The rest were irrelevant. Your lack of reaction became your revelation. They wanted the old version of you, the one that explained, pleaded, or forgave. But that version died quietly the moment betrayal became undeniable. Betrayal always expects noise. It thrives on the drama it creates. They wanted an argument to distract from accountability, a storm to hide in, but silence stripped away their shelter. They had nowhere left to hide their lies. You didn't give them the satisfaction of a scene. You let absence speak. And absence is merciless. It reminds them that you don't care enough to perform. That's what makes silence so powerful. It's not emotional, it's surgical. It cuts ties without spectacle. It dismantles their illusions without confrontation. The betrayer begins to panic when they realize your silence doesn't come from confusion but clarity. You saw everything, processed everything, and simply chose not to engage. That terrifies them more than shouting ever could. They can argue with accusations, they can twist words, but they cannot fight a void. And your silence became exactly that. A void where their power used to live. They will try to return, thinking time has softened you. They will knock gently, testing your patience, pretending remorse. But silence doesn't forget, it transforms. It evolves from response withheld to indifference earned. You've seen behind their words before, now you simply refuse to enter the same loop. Silence is not revenge, it's refusal. Refusal to lower yourself, refusal to relive the pain, refusal to teach lessons they'll never learn. They wanted a reaction to confirm they still mattered, but your silence told them they no longer exist in your world. That realization breaks people. Because for manipulators, existence is only validated by control. Once you remove attention, they dissolve. You didn't destroy them, you stopped feeding them. That's the difference between emotional power and spiritual mastery. They wanted to pull you back into chaos. You answered with absence. And that absence became a mirror they couldn't bear to face. They used to think silence was empty. Now they know it's full of meaning, of consequence, of power. You filled the quiet with intention. Every unanswered message, every avoided confrontation, every calm exit, it all spoke louder than any revenge ever could. They finally realized that silence doesn't mean forgiveness, it means finality. You closed the door so quietly that they didn't notice at first, and by the time they did, you were gone. Not physically, but energetically. You no longer responded to their tricks because you had transcended their language. Betrayal taught you a new vocabulary, one written in stillness, timing, and detachment. They can't reason with silence because silence exposes imbalance. It shows who needs who. And when you no longer needed them, they saw their reflection for what it was. Someone small, desperate, dependent on the reaction of the one they thought they broke. The aftermath of betrayal is not a battlefield. It's a stage where silence delivers justice. You don't chase them, don't explain, don't defend. You just vanish from the emotional equation. They begin to chase ghosts of the connection they once controlled. Every unanswered message becomes a question they can't live with. Every ignored attempt to provoke you deepens their guilt. Because silence creates space, and space magnifies reality. You gave them exactly what they gave you, emptiness, but with intention. They now taste what they once served. You moved differently this time, not to prove anything, but to protect your peace. That kind of stillness is what drives betrayers insane. They can't manipulate a wall that doesn't move. They can't outthink someone who doesn't play. And so, your silence becomes their punishment, not out of cruelty, but out of completion. You stop the cycle they thought would last forever. In the quiet aftermath, they replay everything, trying to pinpoint when they lost control. They look for reasons to justify what happened, but nothing fits. Silence leaves no closure to exploit, no drama to manipulate. It leaves only truth, raw and unaltered. They thought they could explain betrayal into forgiveness, but you knew words meant nothing anymore. You had seen their pattern too many times to be fooled again. Your silence became a declaration that you were finished with their world of excuses. That's what devastates them, the simplicity of it. No speech, no anger, just peace. And peace to a guilty mind feels like punishment. They'll call you heartless, cold, detached. But deep down they know it's not cruelty, it's consequence. You gave them nothing because they gave you lies. That symmetry burns quietly, long after the conversation ends. Your silence carries a wisdom that no apology can erase. They thought distance would soften your heart, but it only sharpened your discernment. You began to see how silence is not avoidance, it's mastery. It requires control to say nothing when every emotion demands release. That's power few ever achieve. You didn't go silent to win, you went silent to heal, to preserve what they tried to drain. You let time do what anger never could, reveal who truly holds strength. They can't reason with you anymore, because reasoning requires mutual respect, and betrayal destroyed that foundation. You gave them what they earned nothing, and in that void, they learned the final truth. Betrayal feeds on attention, and silence kills it. You became untouchable not through rage, but through peace.